It's May 31st, 2024, and welcome to Morning Gen, a daily show offering fresh takes on legal and political news over coffee, Monday through Friday. Friends, we have a lot to talk about today. In fact, I'm not sure how I'm going to cover all 34 topics in around 10 or so minutes, but I will try. As you know, yesterday around 5 p.m., something utterly historic, and I'd like to call euphoric, happened. A jury in New York announced that they had found Donald Trump guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records for the purpose of covering up another crime, namely to interfere in the 2016 election. At first, I was elated, and then I was angry. And I want to tell you why. But before I get to that, I have to stop off first in Crazy Town. So after the verdict, I was getting a lot of contacts from press to come on air and discuss what this verdict meant. And one of those came from the London broadcasting company, LBC, who has a very popular radio show in England. And of course, they're about 5 hours ahead. I always get a little bit confused because of daylight savings time. And I was going to be going on quite late at night for them to talk about the meaning of this verdict here in America. And normally when you do a hit like that, there's a set time. And in this case, they're going to be using Skype. So I arrived after they called on time, and I was waiting in the virtual green room. And things were going longer than normal because the guest who was on the show right before me was none other than Sebastian Gorka. That name may sound familiar to you because he was part of the Donald Trump administration in early 2017 for around 7 months when he was either pushed out or left because he was associated with the alt-right, similar to someone like Steve Bannon. And Gorka is someone who is of British citizenship, Hungarian citizenship, and also naturalized U.S. citizenship. He is someone who associates himself with the kind of very manly man, alpha male personality and leadership. He has worked for Viktor Orban, and he very much behaved in I would call, pseudo alpha male, angry combative style with this host. It was the most bizarre thing that I think I've ever experienced. It was almost laughable. At the same time, I was listening to the content of what he was saying, focused on, in part, condemning the verdict, and in part, condemning Joe Biden and trying to say that Donald Trump was a better and would make a better president in the future. I'd like to zero in for you on what he was saying about the verdict, because that will give you a clue, I think, into the mindset of the loyalists around Trump, as well as what Donald Trump himself might be saying and expressing in the coming days and weeks about the verdict. Naturally, what Gorka said was that it was rigged, it was unfair, and so on. And those are just opinions. But he also tried to make some legal claims that weren't true and made me wonder whether he had gotten his law degree at Trump University. So let me tell you about one of those, because I do think this will be what Donald Trump's lawyers use as a grounds for appeal, and it will be quite interesting how it plays out. So this relates to the jury instructions. And I think we've talked about this for a while or on several occasions, but let me tell you about this main jury instruction that Gorka was objecting to. And that was the sort of third layer down in the crime. So remember, these were 34 counts of violation of the same criminal statute in New York, falsification of business records. And that becomes a felony when, in addition to an intent to defraud, when falsifying or causing business records to be falsified, the defendant also intends to cover up, or further the commission of another crime. Okay, that's it. That's what the statute says. Now, this statute itself doesn't say what other crime. It just it references an other crime. And the judge said, okay, in the jury instructions, here are some possible other crimes. And the main one that I've been focused on, which I do think the jury was focused on, was a New York statute that makes it makes it a crime to unlawfully try to boost someone or hurt someone in an election. Some alternative underlying crimes that the judge discussed during jury instructions on Wednesday was that it could be something like the falsification with an intent to defraud was done to cover up or further tax fraud. Okay. What Gorka was objecting to, which I think you've heard from the Trump camp already, was he was objecting to the fact that the judge during the jury instructions said that while the jury had to unanimously agree that Donald Trump falsified the business records with intent to defraud and intent to cover up or further another crime, they would all have to agree for any of those counts to be a guilty count. The judge said they didn't have to agree on what the actual underlying crime was. As long as it was to further a crime, that's it. So if some of them thought that the cover-up was to further the election fraud, and others saw that it was to further the tax fraud, that was fine. That's what the judge had said in the jury instructions. So the way Gorka was spinning that is he said it's never heard of that a judge would tell a jury that they can convict someone but not to find the crime, where some of them could think the person was guilty of one crime and someone else could think he was guilty of another crime. That is not what the judge said. That is not at all. However, I do expect that this will be a grounds for appeal and that this will possibly go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the reason why I say that is, as I've mentioned on prior occasions, I study white-collar crime. I'm a co-author of a white-collar crime casebook. And when you study white-collar crime, what you study isn't just what the statutes say, whether it's a federal or state statute, about what the elements of the crime are. What you study are appellate decisions where someone appealed their conviction and the judge, the appellate court says, your conviction stands because the jury instructions were right. Or the judge says, we need to overturn this decision because the jury instruction the judge gave was wrong. Now, of course, there are other grounds for appeal. Could be having to do with evidence. It could be all other kinds of things. But quite often, we are studying whether the jury instruction was correct and articulating what the law was. So as much as I believe that there will be an appeal and the sentence will be held up in the long run, I also think it's going to be interesting to see how the courts look at this. Now, of course, it's got to go up through the New York state system, and then there's a separate question of why it would be able to be appealed into the Supreme Court from the highest New York court, but there would have to be an argument that this was a violation of due process of the U.S. Constitution. So I get really excited about these kind of nerdy things, but none of that matters. That Crazy Town stuff, as well as the interesting piece of Crazy Town, doesn't matter in the short run. So that brings us to the main topic of the day, which is this, the guilty verdict. As you know, the jury around 5 p.m. yesterday found Donald Trump guilty on 34 counts of violating this business records statute. So the question now is, what's next? As you probably know, the sentencing date is scheduled for July 11th, which is a Thursday. It just so happens that the following Monday is the Republican National Convention. As a political question, not a legal one, we really have no idea whether Donald Trump will be the nominee by that point. It really depends on what his party says. As for the legal process, the reason why it's pushed out that far is under law, the judge has to ask for what's known as a pre-sentencing report from the probation department. And so this is where stuff gets really interesting. The pre-sentencing report is something put together by the probation department, as I said, but how do they go about doing that? Well, it involves having a psychologist or social worker actually interview Donald Trump, unless he decides to waive the pre-sentencing report, which I think the judge, I'm not sure if the judge would allow that in this case, out of fear there might be some sort of appellate issue. But at any rate, a psychologist or a social worker will come talk to Donald Trump, interview family members, and analyze him, emotionally to decide how to make a recommendation in terms of sentencing. In addition to that, and by the way, my understanding from briefly reading the New York statutes on these, because I normally focus on sentencing at the federal level, it appears that some of this may be confidential, the pre-sentencing report. So there are two other documents, however, that aren't confidential, and that will be the sentencing memo that the prosecution will give to the court and has to give to the defendant, to Donald Trump's counsel, no later than 10 days before the sentencing date. So by July 1st, the prosecution will have to produce that. And what the sentencing memorandum will say is a recommendation from the prosecution as to what sentence they want. This is going to be very critical. And the prosecution will mention a variety of different factors as to why they're making a recommendation based on what is typically done in a nonviolent Class E felony conviction for a first-time offender. This could be anything from probation to 1.5 to 4 years of prison per count. But hold on, that doesn't mean 34 years of prison or more. Usually these are served concurrently if there is incarceration at all. Historically, although falsification of business records in New York is a very common charge, it's often bundled with other kinds of felonies. And as a result of that, when it's done like that, it's there, and often these folks aren't first-time offenders. So those are the cases where you typically see prison sentences. Similarly, the defense will submit its own memorandum to the judge. And then it will be up to the judge on July 11th to declare what the sentence is. Now, again, the sentence could be anything from probation to some kind of prison time. And what happens after that? Well, after that, we can expect that Donald Trump will have already appealed the conviction, and he may also separately appeal the sentence. And it's fairly typical for a judge to, when in something like a nonviolent felony of this type for a first-time offender, to suspend that sentence during the appellate process. Okay, so that brings us to one more question. What kind of factors will the judge look at? Historically, judges will look at remorse. This is not a defendant who is showing any level of remorse. So that will be an important factor. The judge will also probably look at the contempt of court charges and convictions that he had earlier in this case. And I'm certain the judge is going to look at Donald Trump's behavior beginning last night after the conviction all the way through July 11th, because I can imagine he is going to behave badly. Nevertheless, it is highly unlikely that even if he gets any kind of incarceration, it will be in a prison setting, even though Alan Weisselberg did go and is now again in Rikers. It's unlikely, again, even though the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, said Rikers is ready for Donald Trump if necessary. If there is incarceration, it's quite possible it might be with electronic bracelet, where he wouldn't be able to leave his home in New York. But again, that's probably going to be postponed no matter what for a while during the appellate process. Next question. What does that mean in terms of running for election? I get this question a lot. There is no prohibition on someone running for the presidency or even serving the presidency if they've been convicted or if they are actually in prison. So that's something folks should know. What's more complicated, though, because he is a resident of Florida, generally speaking, convicted felons are not or people on probation, I believe. I'm not sure the probation part, but if you are a convicted felon, you're not supposed to, generally speaking, vote in Florida. So it's possible he won't be able to vote in the election. On the other hand, there is some case law to suggest that if the conviction is from a different state that wouldn't treat you that way, he might be able to vote. So there are lots of unknowns here. Okay, so I am going to wrap this up by talking about what I began with when I was first talking about the 34 counts, which is the range of emotions. I'm sure you are also feeling a range of emotions, not just joy, but maybe some sadness that we have for the first time a former president of the United States being convicted. Also, maybe some concern that this might not even make a difference among his diehard MAGA base, and that Donald Trump, in order to lift himself up, will attack these institutions and maybe do something similar to what he did on January 6th, 2021, which is try to harness the anger of his followers toward some sort of violent actions. That could worry us. You might also be feeling angry, like I am, at times, that this interference in the election may have cost Hillary Clinton the victory. Remember, she won in 2016 the popular vote and only lost the presidency because of around 77,000 votes across 3 states. So what I would say is, with all the emotions and with all the unknowns that lie ahead, the only thing we can do, I believe, if we're concerned not just about the rule of law, but also about the future election, is take the win. It's fantastic the system worked. This is a first step. And then separate from the legal side, on the political side, we just need to do everything we can to get people to vote, to make sure that Donald Trump never, ever again has the levers of power. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you again on Monday morning.